good to see you all today. Thanks for coming out. I know that everyone's schedules are incredibly busy, so we appreciate you taking the time today. And I'm going to take you through some regulatory strategies and kind of an intro into FDA regulation. And we do have a relatively small group today, so I would just love to target this talk kind of to you guys directly. I don't know, could we just kind of go around real quick and you could tell me maybe your name and what you're doing? And as we go through the presentation, stop me. If you guys have questions, we can have discussions, and it can be really interactive, which would be good. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Awesome.
All right. I'm Jeremy Ward. I am a member of the Air Force Research Lab's Entrepreneurial Opportunity Program, and I'm partway through my one-year sabbatical in doing market analysis on some airborne technology.
Wonderful.
Looking in the area of personalized medicine.
Great.
Well, I'm Dynesha, here from Dayton. About 4 years ago, well, 3.5 years ago, I went back to school to get my cosmetology license, and as a result of that, I opened up a skincare line. So it's a natural skincare line that heals as well as enhances our beauty.
Wonderful.
But it's targeted for women that don't wear makeup or that's not, that brings out makeup.
Okay.
So it's a barrier and it also heals.
Wonderful. Well, our talk is primarily like med tech, but I know just enough to be dangerous in kind of the area of cosmetics and drugs. So we'll speak to what you're doing directly as well, okay?
I'm Julia, and I'm an entrepreneur. I have created a modified ostomy system for people with ostomies, and I'm in the process of having my prototype made. I've got internet trademark pending, so I need to get a lot more information.
Great.
My name is Anastasia Christopher, and I have a little startup that I began about 7 years ago, and it's my company is Dirt Enterprises, and I've developed a pharmaceutical product, and I've gotten all my patents internationally, but I'm waiting still for the U.S. and it's for women, and it's for postmenopausal women. So a lot of them are underserved in the kind of problems they have. So I'm trying to bring that forward right now.
Great. That sounds good.
My name is Adam. I'm the Chief Technology Officer of ClearMark. Here to observe and make funny faces.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I know we have people joining online as well. And so, Audrey, if you want to just, obviously happy to have them introduce themselves too, or just kind of say what they're working on. Love to do that as well.
So yeah, if you guys drop that. So in the Socio app for our online attendees, when you hit join the live stream, it's going to jump you to a YouTube. Make sure you toggle that and jump back to the tab for the Socio app, and there's a chat. So I'll be monitoring that throughout the day. So as you drop your info in, I'll share that with the group as well.
Great. Wonderful. So let's see if we can get this. All right. Great. So thank you first to Launch Dayton, the Entrepreneur Center, everyone here at the Hub. I feel like they do such a great job of supporting entrepreneurs. As you all know, starting a med tech business is hard. Starting any business is hard. Starting a business in a regulated space is exceptionally difficult. And so a big thank you to all the people who are supporting all the entrepreneurs in the area. As Audrey said, my name is Alison Sathe. I am the CEO at RegulatoryMark and ClearMark, and co-founder of ClearMark. Our other co-founder, Adam, is here. RegulatoryMark is a firm that serves med tech companies. We do regulatory consulting. So basically, we do regulatory strategies and compliance strategies for med tech companies. Anything that's going through CDRH, we say we can handle. So everything from an electronic toothbrush to a EEG system that's in the hospital, we can help with. We also have ClearMark. That's our electronic quality management system platform. So that's a solution that we, when we found we were doing regulatory and quality consulting for our clients, we found that there was really a lack of a great electronic quality management system out there in the market, so we developed ClearMark as well. And happy to answer any questions about that also offline. So today we're going to talk about Product regulation and regulatory strategies. So how to develop a regulatory strategy, what are the regulatory pathways and submissions, what you can expect during those submissions with the FDA, and just some kind of tips for how to work with regulators and how best to engage with FDA to get the results that you need for your company. As I said, our focus is on MEDTECH products. So this is typically anything that goes through CDRH or the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. So as you know, FDA is divided up into a couple main branches when we're talking about MEDTECH or medicines. So that's CDER, CBER, and CDRH. I know we have a couple of pharma and potentially pharma or cosmetic folks in the audience. So please do kind of ask me. Again, I kind of know enough to be dangerous in those areas. So CDRH evaluates new devices and is responsible for ongoing compliance for those devices. They ensure compliance to pre-market and post-market regulations. That's a piece that we'll talk about today because for startups, we find that there's a lot of particular confusion there. The pre-market piece can become really clear for folks because they know, okay, I have to do some kind of submission to get my product to market. But then what is that kind of ongoing compliance piece, which is another huge part as you're starting up your company that you'll need to kind of plan for and understand as you develop. They provide also information to industry, consumers, and healthcare professionals. And when we talk about FDA providing information to industry, that's something where we can talk about what that looks like a little bit more in detail as well, because there are some kind of very clear pathways by which we can interact with the FDA, and so we can talk about how to best use those to your advantage. So CDRH oversight applies to all medical devices. They have about 1,700 different types of generic device types. That differs a little bit from international regulations, where we see more kind of a rule-based structure. They have more of a product code-based structure. And if anybody's looking for international information as well, we can talk about that. We help companies plan for kind of their global regulatory strategy as well. Those pathways differ a little bit from FDA, and the content that you have to provide there differs a little bit from what FDA expects, so we can talk through there. There's also combination products. So combination products are regulated by the branches that are applicable. So if you have a drug device combination product, that will be regulated both by CDER and CDRH. And whether they go primarily on a drug pathway or a device pathway depends on their primary mode of action. I don't know that anybody here has any combination products, but we can certainly talk through that as well. And one thing to note is that now, and this just changed, I guess it was last year at this time where they finished the reorganization at CDRH, but now CDRH is organized along product lines. So that basically means that the review teams that you'll get are very well versed in your product types and have probably seen the same things before. So we'll talk about how important it is to kind of bring the right experts onto your team so that they can interface with the right experts at CDRH, because you will certainly have a knowledgeable review team and review staff within the agency. I just like to put this up so people can see the different offices within FDA. So, you've got your primary offices 1 through 7 where you're looking at the review divisions. And so if I have an in vitro diagnostic, that's going to be going to review office 7. If you've got an orthopedic device, 6. And you kind of have these teams structured within these clinical areas or clinical specialties along the entire product life cycle. So these folks that will be reviewing your product, they're also familiar with post-market issues, compliance issues that similar products or devices have had in the marketplace, because again, now they're kind of organized along that total product life cycle structure. So we'll start in on kind of how to develop a regulatory strategy. We've broken this down into a couple steps. Obviously, there's a lot that goes into this. But I'll go through these in a little bit more detail. But kind of the first step seems obvious, but it's really to determine whether or not you have a medical device. And I think you mentioned you were in some data data management. So a lot of these new devices, when you're looking at kind of data, general health and wellness devices, those may or may not be actually regulated devices, depending on what they do, their indications, et cetera. So that's kind of the first step in the process, is determining if you actually have a regulated product or not. Similarly, in the cosmetics area, I think if you're looking at your products, it might be a cosmetic, it might be a drug, based on the claim that you're making. And so that's something that we'll talk through a little bit there, is determining if your product, yes?
Excuse me, is there a separate regulatory aid part of FDA for botanicals? Like, say it's
That's a good question.
product.
It's a good question. So there's a term that is not recognized by FDA that's nutraceutical, right? And so when you're looking at supplements, that is one thing. And there are some registration requirements around things like supplements that are starting to become more enforced. I will say FDA has recognized and is concerned about this space. Where you see a little bit of a gray area is technically those products, if they're labeled with drug claims, become a drug. So I'll give you an example that's actually a cosmetic example of this. There was a warning letter a number of years ago that went out to manufacturers of wrinkle cream manufacturers, right? And they basically said, you are making drug claims on these wrinkle treatment creams that need to go through the drug division. You can't say these things, right? And so that's one of the things that we'll get into in labeling. Similarly, in like botanicals, nutraceuticals, which again is not a recognized term, but supplements, the space where they become more heavily regulated is when they get into that drug space. Now, of course, if you go online, you can see vitamins that are advertised for everything in the world. So I will say kind of the enforcement in that area probably hasn't caught up to where FDA would like it to be, but absolutely, I think, historically the trend has been toward more regulation, and as we get more and more of these advanced kind of botanicals and nutritional supplements, there's going to be more space carved out for that within the FDA. Yep. Step 2, then, once you recognize if you have a regulated product, whether that's a drug or a device or a biologic, then determining what your product classification is if you're going through CDRH. Next is determining what your pre-market strategy needs to be in accordance with your product classification. And then what are the compliance requirements, so like post-market compliance requirements, QMS requirements, et cetera. And then step 4 is implementation. And I like step 4 because it's one word, but that's probably the hardest thing to do, right? It's like just do all of that work that you identified you need to do for the agency and for your own infrastructure and quality. So here's the definition of a medical device. I will not read this. It seems like it's straightforward. It is not. So here's a couple of caveats to this, right? And I love this last line here when we have the term device does not include software functions excluded pursuant to section 520. So there are carve-outs and areas of enforcement discretion with FDA for special kinds of products. And I think on our next slide we have special cases. Software functions that are excluded pursuant to section 520. And of course, we're seeing a lot of this right now, right? Software is a medical device or non-medical device function software. There are guidance documents that help people determine whether your device meets that criteria or not. I will say in a lot of cases, it's a little bit of a gray area. So it's not just kind of reading the guidance, it's really looking into that regulatory landscape, looking at precedent, looking at claims, and a lot of other things. That's something that we help folks with quite frequently, and lots of regulatory experts can kind of help you in that space of that determination. You also have general wellness products. Of course, this is a huge area and a growing area of industry. We've got a picture of the Oura Ring up there. I wear one, I have one on. And these types of products for general health and wellness may or may not be a device, depending on what they do and the claims that they make about their functionality. And then LDTs, so laboratory developed tests. have been a space of contention for a very long time with the agency. I don't know if anybody's developing an LDT here. Right now, FDA still retains the authority to enforce actions against IVD makers that claim to be LDTs. There are some special requirements for LDTs, but that's been a real gray area for both industry and the agency historically. There has been a lot there have been laws proposed and bills proposed to clarify this, and there's actually one that's going through Congress right now called VALID. So everyone in regulatory is waiting with bated breath to see what is going to happen in that space as well. But in all of these cases, it's really important to understand where you fit in the landscape. So if you do have an edge case where you think, you know what, we're probably under an area of enforcement discretion by FDA, that's great. That means that you might not need the extent of documentation that you would if you were a regulated product. However, you want to really clearly document that decision-making process, typically in the form of a letter to file or something else, where you can show, here's how we made our decision, here's how it's based on this best and most recent information, and then keeping up with that as that changes, because the landscape's constantly changing, in the regulatory space. So when we're looking at kind of the purpose of your medical device to see if it meets that definition of a device, we will be looking at your indications for use and your intended use. So actually, FDA just issued a final rule updating intended use and how that's interpreted by the FDA. In general, we kind of have our intended use and indications for use described here. The intended use is the general purpose of the device or its function, right? And then the indications for use are typically a little bit more specific when you're describing the disease or the condition that the device is going to diagnose or treat, and the patient population for which it's intended. And typically in labeling, we like to see both. In regulatory submissions, we like to see both. But at a minimum, you have to have your indications for use stated really clearly in your device labeling. So intended use becomes an interesting space. It's not just how you label your product, although it is in your product labeling. And I highlight this area here, right, because it's shown by the manufacturer's expression, the design or composition of the product itself, and the circumstances surrounding the distribution of the article. What does that chaos mean within FDA speak, right? It basically means you can't have a device that does one thing, and if you label it for another thing, then that's your labeling and that's your intended use, right? The product is going to have its intended use expressed not just by its labeling, but by its design, by its features, by how people use that product. So everything from your technological characteristics to your labeling is kind of included in interpreting how this device or product will be used. And then just a note on labeling. FDA interprets the term labeling very broadly. So it's not just the paper or the electronic paper that you provide with your product. It's also what you say in the public sphere, how your sales reps are representing your product, what your brochures say, what your training materials say. So for example, if you have surgical device X that's cleared for a tool, what we call a tool type indication. Let's say you say it's cleared for cutting and coagulation, of soft tissues. But then you're advertising this as a specific treatment for cancer. FDA would say there's a mismatch here between what you're cleared for, which is soft tissue cutting and coagulation, and what you're marketing for, which is also your labeling, which is a treatment for cancer. And so you need to make sure as kind of the management of your company that your labeling and your regulatory submissions are in alignment. These are just excerpts from very exciting instruction manuals that I pulled from online. And I just do this to say, okay, here's where we see your indications for use. Here's where we have an intended use statement. Those are very brief descriptions in the labeling. Obviously, there's lots of other information that goes into that definition. And so that's really important to understand as you're classifying your device and as you're planning to market your device. Now, I will say there are regulatory strategies that you can put into place where you pursue expanded indications in a way that is more gradual, right? We kind of call them stepwise 510Ks, where you might go to market with a minimum indication because you have the data to support that, and follow on the heels of that an expanded indication when you have more data. So there's certainly common strategies for kind of going into the marketplace and then growing and expanding your indication and your labeling. And so that's just something to think about as you think about your regulatory strategy and your pathway to market. Okay, so just an example here. We've got a sleep app. It does the exact same thing. It promotes relaxation, it tracks sleep and wake cycles, it tracks your total sleep time, all of these things for healthy sleep behaviors. Maybe it makes personalized recommendations for you for how to enhance your sleep quality. On the left side, we would have something that we would say, that's probably a general wellness product. It's supposed to be for a healthy life cycle and keep people healthy, and that's great. On the right side, the only difference here is that it says it treats insomnia. That would probably kick that into the space of being a medical device, right? It's making a claim for a specific disease or condition, and it's being marketed in that manner. Actually, one of the things that I saw at the beginning of COVID that I almost fell out of my chair for was an advertisement for the Oura Ring, and I promise I'm not a spokesperson for this product, I love it, but they said, we can detect COVID 2 days in advance. And I said, ooh, somebody's regulatory team is going to get really mad at that. That's not something that you can say as a general wellness product because, of course, they don't have a clearance for that type of claim. So all of these claims, all that to say, these claims go into how you are, what your regulatory pathway is going to be and how the FDA is going to view your device or your product in the case of kind of a lotion or a topical or your nutritional supplement or your botanical.
If you were working with this particular person, would you tell them or suggest to them that they drop the advertised part and just that way they won't get triggered?
It's a very good question because what we do is we like to see ourselves as informers of risk. And so for this company that's on the right, they might say, hey, advertising for insomnia gives us this huge advantage and we want this to be used in sleep clinics all over the world, right? And in that case, I would say, great, here's what your regulatory pathway would be if you do that, right? Here's what your regulatory pathway would be if you don't. And so really it's just a matter of kind of trade-offs and business decisions, right? How much do you want to invest in your regulatory process to support the claims that you need to support your business?
So that would be much more money because of the clinical trials.
Yeah.
'Cause you have to prove it.
Yeah, absolutely, right? And so we'll get into that a little bit, but in terms of kind of the pathway for FDA, whether you're doing kind of a substantial equivalence or a pre-market approval, there are different pathways. But in general, FDA is looking at the safety and effectiveness of your products, right? And so one way or another, you're going to have to demonstrate to the agency that your products are safe and effective for their intended use. And so it might be something where, again, we would talk through, here's what your regulatory submission would probably look like. Here's the data that you would need to support that. And then, kind of as a team effort, it's kind of figuring out, okay, what are the costs? What are the timelines? What does this get us in the marketplace? All of those things kind of go into your decision making as an entrepreneur and as a business founder. And so one of the things that I do like to tell startups and founders is understanding your regulatory process early is very, very key because that'll impact how much money you're going to need to raise, what kind of team you need to put into place around you, what kind of infrastructure you're going to need to support these pathways. And so I always tell people when they're getting started to really make sure you understand your regulatory requirements and then also IP, right? Because that's something that you just want to button up really early. And I see Chad walked in. If you have any IP questions, you can talk to Chad in the back. He's an expert in that area as well. Okay, so once we've determined, yes, we have a medical device or we have a regulated product, the agency is going to want to look at this. It's going to need to go through the FDA. And again, we're focused here on the US, but we can talk through regulatory requirements globally as well and regulatory strategy globally. But the second step after determining that you are going to go through the agency is, what is your pathway? What is the right pre-market submission that I need to do, and what are my post-market requirements? So this determination can really be made when you have a reasonable idea of what your intended use and your indication for use are, and what your technological characteristics in general will be for your product, right? So when we have folks come to us for regulatory strategies, sometimes we have a pitch deck and that's it. And that's sometimes enough, right? The more specific you are, the more specific we can get, especially on things like what's the type of testing that's going to be needed for your submission, because some of that depends on your technological characteristics in particular. In the United States, device classification is based on product code for devices. In general, in kind of the drug area, there's a couple different submission types that we won't get into, but for devices, each generic type of device is assigned to one of 3 classifications, and then there's multiple product codes that might be applicable to your product itself. And of course, the level of control necessary is based on the risk of the device. So you've got kind of these class 1 product codes. That's your lowest classification. That would be something like a Band-Aid or a toothbrush. And then all the way up to class 3, that's the highest risk classification. And so those products obviously differ quite a bit on the regulatory submissions that FDA needs to see. One device might have several FDA product codes associated with it. So especially now where we have complex medical products and systems, that's more and more common. So it's absolutely appropriate for FDA to have multiple product codes associated with one device. So for example, I might have an EEG system that's measuring brain activity, and it might also have a software component that is used for the display of that information or other kinds of display or analysis. Those 2 aspects of your product may have different product codes. They may even have different classifications. And especially for those of you who are developing systems, this is important to keep in mind because you do have flexibility in how you classify accessories to your product. You can submit those as a system to the FDA, and sometimes that makes sense. You can also separate those out, and sometimes that makes sense too. It just depends, case-by-case basis.
Does it cost more?
It depends. So that's the favorite regulatory answer. It depends. It depends on whether you need to do multiple submissions. So if you see something typically that needs that you have 2 class 2 products, oftentimes it makes sense to submit those together. You don't have kind of 2 separate submissions with all the costs that's associated with that. But if you have one product that's a class 2 product and it's paired with, let's say, a non-medical device function software, then it might make sense to separate that. And FDA has a lot of guidance around those points and how to make those determinations, guidance on things like interoperability of products as well. So that's something that we help companies sort out. And I say kind of regulatory intelligence is key. It really is, because it can be a very complex landscape. And so making sure that you kind of have a good handle on the regulatory landscape, on FDA precedent in these areas is really key to making sure that you feel comfortable and confident with your strategy. Because I think as a business owner, that's where you want to be, right? You're going in front of investors and other people and talking about your regulatory process and strategy. So making sure that you know that that's rock solid is really important. So we talked a little bit about this, right? Class 1, lowest risk, general controls, typically doesn't require a 510K. Class 2, medium risk, general and special controls, typically requires a 510K. And Class 3, highest risk, general controls plus pre-market approval. And so the difference there, and I don't know, are people familiar with the term 510K? So 510Ks are a regulatory submission. We'll get into it in just a second. But the standard there that you're looking at when you're submitting a 510K is a standard of substantial equivalence. So in that case, rather than proving that your product is safe and effective, which would require large-scale clinical trials, you are demonstrating that your product is substantially equivalent to a legally marketed device. So basically it's saying it's as safe and effective as this other product or these other products that are on the market. As you can imagine, 510Ks are easier than PMAs in that the burden is typically lower, right? If you do need a clinical trial for a 510K, which is still relatively rare, it's becoming more common, but it's still not the norm, it looks a lot different than a PMA clinical trial, which would be very large. So how do we know what our product code is? Once we know, okay, we have a medical device, we know what it does, we have identified our technological characteristics. There's a couple ways to do this. We do this in a couple different ways. Method 1, 2, and 3 is what FDA says. They tell you, look at FDA's product classification database, search for similar devices in the marketplace, and search for similar devices by device listing, and I absolutely agree. So here you can see on the screen, this is FDA's product code database. The simplest way to start is putting search terms into device. Now, you do have to be a little familiar and search these pretty extensively. So for example, if you want to clear a trocar for laparoscopic procedures, rather than being under a product classification described as trocar, it's actually described as an accessory to a endoscopic camera. So FDA likes to do little things like that where the searching is not as easy as you would hope it would be sometimes, but this is a great place to start. And what this will return for you is lots of different product codes and then the regulation number that's associated with those. And by going through and doing various searches, you can kind of hone in on what's the right classification and what's the right product code for your product. And when you get to that right product code, then your regulatory pathway becomes very clear. When we're doing product classification and regulatory strategy, we also like to search a couple different places rather than kind of just here where the FDA recommends. So we like to actually search the CFR. So we're coming down to kind of the Code of Federal Regulations and then coming up to the product code level from that. We also like to search the 510K database, the Denovo database, the PMA database, and then as FDA says here, registration and listing. We also come at it from a market perspective, right? So if you're doing a endoscopic stapler, you're probably going to want to look at how did Ethicon clear their endoscopic staplers? What was the pathway they followed? And you can get a lot of regulatory intelligence from that as well. And I guess I skipped ahead a little bit. Establishment registration. I did say also good ID when necessary. So all devices now are required to have a unique device identification. That's something that you guys will need to do if you put a product on the market, is have UDI on your labeling. And there's a database called Good ID that records all of the unique device identification for various products on the market, and also connects you with things like their GMDN code, which is important for international registrations, their 510K numbers, their PMA numbers. All of those things get recorded. So Good ID is a great website as well. You can just search Access Good ID or Good ID database, and you can search those also. We talked about researching from multiple approaches to ensure that you have a complete picture of that regulatory landscape. Very important. And I say use FOIA when applicable. So the Freedom of Information Act, you can request any document that you want from FDA. If you're willing to wait 2 years, you'll be very pleased with the results. Unfortunately, sometimes it does take that long. However, sometimes if they have searched and provided that information before, you can get it relatively quickly. So it's oftentimes worth just going in and requesting it to see if you can get it in a timely manner. If you can't, the FDA will tell you that, and you can cancel your request so that you're not charged for it, and you are charged a nominal fee for them to pull that information and send that to you.
Now, are you assuming that it's already patented or trademarked or whatever?
Yeah, so under FOIA, this would be anything that has been submitted and has been cleared, approved, et cetera, listed, so you can request those documents, yeah. If you don't have something, so let's say you know something's under development from a different company and they haven't made their submission yet to the FDA, that wouldn't be researchable under FOIA. Yeah, good question. And then, of course, competitive products, right? We like to look at competitive products. What are their indications for use? What are their claims? What marketing materials do they use? What's on their website? We look at that a lot. Mm-hmm.
Will we have access to these slides?
I believe so. Are they going to be made available? Great. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm going to put my contact information in here as well. I love talking about this stuff, so please call me. I'm happy to talk to you all about any questions that you might have on this process.
Alison, one more question. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
No.
They have to be fully patented before the FDA will approve them, right?
No, so there are actually two different processes. And actually, we can send you a slide deck. Chad and I did a presentation together a while back on kind of integrating your IP and regulatory strategies and how to kind of best consider those two aspects of your process. It's an interesting dichotomy because in your IP, of course, you're trying to differentiate your product. And then in your regulatory submission, you're trying to say no new concerns, no new questions of safety and efficacy. So absolutely, that's something to think through. But FDA does not require you to have kind of patent protection or trademarking or anything when they see your product. They're not concerned about that.
It's different though with drugs.
Yes, because that's right. And so with drugs, yes, very good point. With devices, it doesn't matter per se. With drugs, you do have different pathways. So if you've got something that you're doing on an ANDA, that looks very different than an NDA, right? And you've got different pathways available, like the 505B, 505C, right? If you've got something that's already being,
505B2.
yes, that's already being used. Yeah, absolutely. Very good distinction. Okay, so now we know what our product is a medical device. We know what the regulation is. We know the product code associated with it. The next step is determining your regulatory submission that's required. So this is kind of what we think about as your pre-market activities for this product. Everyone has to do registration and listing. So that's regardless of what kind of medical device you have, everybody has to do it. It's the same fee for everyone. And you have to register and list your device before you put it into commercialization. So that basically means if you have a Class 1 product, you can do that right before you're ready to commercialize your device. If you have a Class 2 product where you have a 510K or a Denovo, you actually have to wait until you get that cleared to do your device listing. So you can't do it before then. Same with the PMA. You have to wait to do your establishment registration and your device listing. 510Ks, as we stated, that's a pre-market notification. That is demonstrating substantial equivalence to a legally marketed device. So you're demonstrating that you're as safe and effective as something that's legally marketed. And we'll talk through that in just a second about what that looks like in terms of how you demonstrate that to the FDA. Pre-market approvals are pre-market applications, or pre-market applications are approvals rather than clearances. So that basically means the FDA is looking at this standalone for safety and effectiveness. There's no comparative standard. And then Denovo is a classification request. And the Denovo submissions have gained more popularity in recent years because FDA retooled that program a little bit, and they put some performance goals around that as well. And basically what that is if you have something that is low risk, so a Class 1 or 2 device, but there's no predicate, you can't make a comparison because it's so novel. You can't make a comparison to something that's already on the market. You can file a de novo. And that submission looks a little bit different than a 510K. But basically, at the end of the day, what you do is FDA gives you a new product code and enters a new classification into the CFR. And then from then on, any product that's in that code can go through the FDA with a 510K. Just for planning purposes, user fees. So these are the fees associated with the submission types. Again, that annual registration fee, that's for everyone, and you don't get a small business discount for that. For small businesses, obviously the discount is substantial. So filing a small business designation before your submission to the FDA is very wise. Otherwise, you're going to be paying a lot more. These are for fiscal year 2022. They change every year slightly, and so those are published usually around, I believe it's like the beginning of summer. They're published for the following year. And that fiscal year goes from October 1st to the end of September every year. So, Small businesses designation, again, to qualify as a small business, you need to have less than 100 million in sales. So it's a pretty liberal definition of a small business, which is great. Filing is very easy. People ask us to help them with that all the time. We're happy to do that, but you can also just kind of do it yourself. There's a guidance out there. It's a simple form, and you submit evidence of your tax return. Very easy to do. You do want to file that probably about 60 days before you're going to need that, although usually they turn it around really quickly, like 2 weeks. And you just want to make sure it's within the same fiscal year that you're going to be making your application. And the way it works is when you're actually paying your user fee on the portal, you plug in that SBD number that you get, and then you get the reduced fee. Device registration and listing, again, people ask us to help them with that. We're happy to do it, but it's easy to do yourself. There's a great CDRH Learn video on this, and basically you set up an online account, you register your establishment, and list your device. Now what this means is when you do that, the FDA considers that you have put your product into commercial distribution, right? So you're kind of a company that is distributing your product at that time. That doesn't mean the FDA is going to come in for an audit the next day, but it does mean that they could. So you're officially listed with the FDA. 510K. So 510Ks, and I think I'm taking a little too long, so I'm going to kind of speed through a little bit more of this, but do feel free to stop and ask me questions. 510K, again, substantially equivalent. We've talked about a little bit, so I'll skip over this. I just love this comparison because the Class 2 classification is so broad that you get everything from a sharp spin to this entire system, which is the Da Vinci system, cleared as 510Ks. So obviously the submission that you're going to put forward for the sharp spin is going to look a lot different than the submission you're going to put forward for your Da Vinci robot. It's a very flexible standard, and that's what makes it really helpful for manufacturers. But obviously, with all that flexibility, sometimes entrepreneurs or startups that haven't done this before can feel a little bit lost in terms of what do I need to submit? What's the right level of data that FDA wants to see? And that's something that we or any regulatory experts can help you with determining that. There are a couple different types of 510K. Most frequently, traditional is what you would be working with, and particularly if this is your first product. Special 510Ks are really for changes to products that you've already marketed. They have a short review time, 30 days versus the traditional 90 days, so that's great when available. And then abbreviated 510Ks for products that have some special guidance or controls that have been promulgated. So a couple different types of 510Ks available. I'm mentioning third-party review here because it has become more popular in recent years. There are some products that are eligible for what's called third-party review. So instead of submitting your 510K to the agency, you submit it to a certified third-party reviewer. FDA certifies these folks to do the third-party review. They work interactively with you to get it to a place where they feel FDA would approve it or clear it. Then they submit it to FDA and make a recommendation to FDA. And then the FDA has a very short review time where they would either accept or deny the recommendation of the third-party reviewer. Historically, it took longer and cost more than kind of the traditional 510Ks. But I haven't done one recently, and I hear that they're actually expedited for certain subsets. So on PACS or MIMP systems, which are viewing systems, sometimes those can go very quickly. So it's a good option to explore if you have that ability with your product. Yes?
Is there a difference between the FDA clearing it and approving it?
Yes, very good question. And you've heard me go back and forth a little bit on that. So clearance is always for products that go through the 510K pathway or the de novo pathway. Approval is reserved for products that go through the PMA pathway. Yep. And so that's that difference in kind of the data that they're looking at. They can approve a PMA product because the demonstration there is that product is safe and equivalent. They can clear a 510K product because that has been deemed as safe and as effective as the predicate device. So it's a subtle distinction, but really important, and important when you're kind of communicating out in the marketplace as well to kind of understand those two distinctions. 510K content for traditional 510Ks, they all look the same in terms of the sections. So if you have a section that's not applicable, let's say you've got a hardware product with no software, I always still like to include section 16 and have a sentence that says this is not applicable because there's no software in the product. So you'll always have these. The first 8 sections are really kind of administrative sections, and then you get kind of into the data portion in kind of sections 9 through 20. This is FDA's 510K decision-making flowchart. Absolutely, if you're doing a 510K, you can familiarize yourself with this. This is how they review to see if the device is substantially equivalent. Where you're typically going to see yes all the way down to this decision 3, right? Decision 3 is it the same technological characteristics? The answer to that is probably going to be no, because you've got a new product, right? You've got new technological characteristics. That's why you're making it, because it's better than the old one. And so that's where you kind of get into, okay, do the technological characteristics raise different questions of safety and effectiveness? And is that mitigated by data? And that's what your 510K is there for, is to show the FDA that even the slight differences between you and your predicate don't raise new types of questions of safety and effectiveness. One thing that comes up often is this question of multiple predicates and reference devices and how to effectively use those. If you do have a 510K, we're happy to talk you through what that looks like. You can use multiple predicates. However, both have to be demonstrated fully substantially equivalent to your product. So you can't kind of cherry pick features from one thing that has a different intended use and apply it to your product that has that's used in a totally different space. And an example of this here, right, is like, let's say you've got this endotracheal tube and you've got kind of 2 separate types of tubes or orogastric tubes. And one has a different lure connection that's external to the body, and one has a different tip, but they're both orogastric tubes that are going to be used in similar clinical settings. Absolutely, it would be appropriate to use 2 different predicates to demonstrate that that's substantially equivalent. If you have different intended uses for your predicates, that's where it gets a little bit dicey and you want to pay a little bit closer attention. Reference devices are also frequently used. These are where you're looking at something like a test method. So let's say you've got a knee implant that has a special coating on it. No other knee implants have that coating, but hip implants do. That might be a space where you could have a reference to that hip implant, even though it has a different intended use. It's close enough to the technological characteristic that demonstrating that it's useful as a reference device for demonstrating that test method for that coating. We talked a little bit about de novos. So again, the Denovo request is a reclassification request. So if you have a product that you can't find a predicate for, which does happen, but it is low risk, you can pursue the de novo pathway. And again, that has a lot of the same content as a 510K, but it also has that information about what are the special controls that are needed for FDA to assure safety and effectiveness going forward if they do make that reclassification for your product. Here's just some examples of Denovo products. So, it's kind of interesting, right? A video game to improve attention function for kids with ADHD, powered toothbrushes, really kind of a broad spectrum. You see a lot of IVDs going through the Denovo process as well. And then PMAs. So PMAs, again, have to be demonstrated to be safe and effective. They're high-risk devices. And some examples of these are, knee replacement systems, cosmetic fillers, ventricular assist devices, high-risk types of products. There are some special programs as well. EUA, of course, with COVID has been huge the past couple of years. There's a lot to consider there that we won't go into, because not just are we looking at kind of is the product serving during a medical emergency, it's also, is it high priority for the FDA? So they make that determination as well, so that they can kind of prioritize their resources. So if they have, if the market has enough test systems then they might deprioritize test systems. If the market has enough test reagent, they might deprioritize reagent for looking at things like COVID. Breakthrough Devices program. So in Breakthrough Devices and STEP, the Safer Technologies program, both of these programs allow for the manufacturer to have more interactive review with the FDA. So they can be really helpful in terms of getting your product to market if they meet the criteria for acceptance for Breakthrough Device or STEP. Breakthrough Devices are for life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating diseases or conditions. So the threshold for getting into that program is a little bit higher than STEP, whereas STEP is kind of for conditions that have less severe consequences. But in both cases, what they're trying to do there is make sure these products get to market in a reasonable time frame by, again, doing that more interactive review, prioritizing the review of these submissions, and potentially having a more flexible clinical evaluation, so utilizing things like real-world evidence and things like that. QSR, we're going to talk about actually in the next session, so we'll skip over this a little bit, but this is also a part of Step 3, right? So part of Step 3 in terms of understanding your regulatory compliance requirements, part of that is PreMarket, and then part of that is this quality management system and infrastructure that the FDA requires of medical device companies. Okay, so Step 4 is the implementation, right? So once you know what you need to do with the agency, you know you've got a 510K, how do you actually go about doing that? I wanted to put in some of their performance goals just so you guys could have a sense. However, don't get too excited about these timelines because they're usually longer. So when you're looking at 510Ks, there's a kind of a 3-step process, 15 days for the refusal to accept. That's basically where they say, okay, is your submission administratively complete? Then you kind of wait for that 60-day time frame where they're doing their substantive review of the submission. At that point, you'll typically get feedback from the FDA that either says, everything looks good here, we're going to finish this out with interactive review in the next 30 days, or more commonly, we have requests for additional information and clarification. At that point, when you get that letter, which is usually about 60 days, your submission goes on hold, and you have up to 180 days to respond to the FDA. So you might be able to turn that around very quickly and respond to them in a couple weeks, and that's great. Or if you need to do more testing or collect more data, it might take a little bit longer. Once you submit back to the FDA, then they have the rest of that 90-day time frame so basically it's like anything past 60 days, usually it's about 30 days that you have until you get your determination back from the agency. Denovo's, their review time is 150 days, and you'll see this. So like their performance goal for 510Ks, FDA's, is that 95% of submissions are answered within this 90-day time frame. So some of them do take longer. Denovo, you'll see their performance goal is only 70% for that 150-day time frame. That's because, again, this program is newer. They just put performance goals. I guess the retooling of the program is a little bit newer. It's been around for a long time, but the way they've redone it is relatively new. We do see Denovo's kind of going a bit longer than that frequently. And then PMAs here, again, the 15 days, the filing status within 45, substantive interaction within 90, and then a decision date issued within 180 days. And so you see kind of more adherence to those performance goals in PMAs and 510Ks than Denovo's. And then the QSub program. So are you guys all familiar with QSubs? So these have gained a lot of popularity, and I will say especially in the startup crowd, because the folks who are doing the investing love pre-sub meetings because they love to hear from the FDA if your regulatory strategy is correct. So you will probably hear a lot about this if you haven't before. QSub meetings, the QSub program is basically to allow the company to interact with the FDA to plan out their submission or pathway, or to ask specific questions about their regulatory requirements. So there's a couple different kinds of QSubs. The most common that you'll hear about a lot are PreSubs, pre-submission meetings. So that's before a 510K, a de novo, a PMA. It's kind of like a planning meeting where you would propose your strategy to the FDA and ask them some pointed questions. So let's say I've got a 510K, I know it's going to need clinical data, and I feel like the right sample size for this is 60 patients. I might submit a pre-sub to FDA and say, hey, here's our process, here's our product, here's our statistical analysis plan. Can you provide feedback on, our endpoint and our analysis of our statistical analysis plan? And they would give you that feedback. So it's a way to get confirmation of your strategy from the agency. There's also submission information request meetings, SIRs. That's after you've made a submission. If they ask you questions that you need more clarification on, you can do an SIR. So that's basically while you're in the midst of a submission, you can ask them for feedback in this QSub process. Study risk determinations. So if you're conducting a clinical trial and you don't know if it's non-significant risk or not non-significant risk, that's the determination of whether it needs an investigational device exemption by FDA or not. You can ask the FDA. I would say propose to the FDA your strategy and let them give you feedback on that. And then there's informational meetings. And so those are utilized typically by larger companies, but that's really to just inform FDA of what you're developing and kind of give them advance notice on your product. Typically, you do not get feedback in informational meetings, just to show them things. Then there's others. Others are kind of all grouped together. You've got your PMA kind of informational meetings, 100-day meetings, agreement and determination meetings. The breakthrough devices and STEP programs, those are both applied to via a pre-sub. So basically, you would be requesting entrance into these programs through a QSub meeting. Here's the timing for pre-subs. So they try to get back to you within 70 days for a pre-sub. That feels like a long time. That's actually pretty quick for the agency, and they do usually hit that. COVID messed some things up with timing, and actually some review divisions stopped doing pre-subs for a short amount of time. I believe that they're all back up and running with pre-subs now. SIRs, this is a really important distinction on timing, because if you do have a question that you want to ask the agency and you are in the middle of your, you got your additional information request back, first step is to have a 10-day meeting with them, a 10-day call. The next step, if you need further clarification, would be that SIR. If you go past 60 days of getting your AI letter, then they don't have to respond to you until 70 days. So if you are doing an SIR, you really want to get it submitted within the first 60 days, because then they have only 21 days to get back to you. So, some things to consider when submitting a pre-sub. And actually, sorry, this top bullet is worded weirdly. But basically, when you're doing a pre-sub, it's good to do those when you're considering an IDE, when you're considering a 510K, where you have questions about your approach or about the data that's needed to substantiate your submission. If you have a device that doesn't clearly fit within your, if you don't have a great predicate, it's good to kind of get some feedback and concurrence from the FDA prior to making your submission. If you're doing a de novo, that might be a good time to do a pre-sub as well. Here's some examples that are actually from the FDA of good questions, right? And you'll see here as you read through those, I won't read them all to you, but they're really targeted, right? You provide all of the data to the FDA that they need to give you the right feedback that's going to be helpful for you and for your company. We have seen folks that have kind of come to us after they've had one, or we even had a company that had 3 pre-sub meetings with the FDA. They still weren't satisfied with their responses. So we said, okay, give us the information to take a look at. And when reading through those submissions, it became really clear why they weren't getting the information they needed. And it's because they weren't providing the right framework for getting that good information back from the agency. I feel like if you're going through the trouble of engaging with the agency and asking them questions, you want to do it in a way that's going to be most beneficial for you. So really planning out what that pre-sub strategy is really important. Here's some FDA examples of what not to do. And some of these are pretty clear, right? If you have an appeal, it doesn't go through the QSub process. Addressing questions that a reviewer could readily answer. You can call your reviewers, right? So you can ask them questions. Sometimes they'll give you answers and sometimes not, depending on what the question is. So asking the appropriate types of questions in a pre-sub is really important, right? You want your questions to be targeted, and you want to really like do your homework, know what you're asking and the information that you need from the reviewer. Here's some tips. I think you like to start with the end in mind, right? You don't want to go in and just ask FDA broad sweeping questions like, what do you think about XYZ? You really want your questions to be focused and targeted, and to come in with a strategy that's very well reasoned and supported on with data, so that they can give you clear responses. And again, that's just going to make things better for you in terms of timing and cost, right? Allowing time for discussion, usually you have 1 hour, that's it. That is it, and they will shut it down at 1 hour. That is all you're getting. And that's okay, but I always, want the FDA to talk more than we talk in those meetings, right? If you have very clear questions and you can interject the right data at the right time point, you want to hear what the agency has to say. Taking detailed notes, of course, summarizing at the end of the meeting what's going to be the next step with the agency. And then, of course, you always have to send those meeting minutes within 15 days for the FDA to review. So just to kind of wrap this piece up in terms of pre-market pathways, I think starting early is really important. Obviously, we could have talked for hours on any one of those topics that we went through today. So starting early is really key, really understanding what's your strategy, what are the steps that you need to take with the agency, and what do those timelines look like? Because in general, they can be pretty long, right? They can be pretty long, and there's a lot of data that's needed to support submissions. So start early and revisit often. So obviously the regulatory landscape is continuously changing, and you want to make sure that if you did your regulatory research 6 months ago, maybe in the last 6 months, a new product was cleared that makes a better predicate. Or maybe there was a recall that revealed some design flaw that you also have that design in your product and you need to address that in some way. So really revisiting often is important. Having the right experts on your team. So regulatory submissions, I think, work the best when you have very strong engineering and clinical partners, right? So the engineering folks can not just do the right testing, but have the right strategy and scientific rationale around that testing. It's really important. Having the right clinicians. If you're doing animal testing, the veterinarians. All of these things are actually really important when it comes to your submissions. Toxicologists. This is huge right now, right? Biocompatibility is one of I think it's actually the most cited issue in 510Ks are questions around biocompatibility, and that is getting more and more rigorous. We actually have 2 toxicological risk teams that we actually work with for very complex products from the biocompatibility standpoint, and that really pays off thinking about that up front and understanding what's the type of testing that's needed and what are those test methods. Using FDA resources. FDA has actually a pretty great website and can be really helpful in some areas. So looking for the guidance documents, the standards, they're coming out with tons and tons and tons of guidance documents. Especially compared with like 10 years ago, there's just a lot of guidance out there. So making sure that you know what's out there and that what FDA is expecting, which is oftentimes put in these guidance documents. Standards. So ISO 10993, your biocompatibility standard. If you have something that's touching a patient, you're going to be citing that often, right? Knowing those standards that are applicable and understanding what's in those standards. There's also, they have now the Biocompatibility Resource Center at FDA. To be quite honest, this is just in the last 6 months. I have not used that, but they have an email that you're supposed to be able to ask biocompatibility questions to now, which I can foresee being very helpful. I don't have any experience with that yet. The resource center that they have is just really a regurgitation of their guidance document, which is absolutely okay. The guidance is very good. But I would encourage people to use that. ensuring your application requirements and your deliverables are being addressed as part of your design control activities. In the next session, we're going to talk a little bit more about design control, but making sure that that's integrated so that you don't get kind of halfway or all the way through design control and say, oh no, we needed to do that same study but with a slightly different endpoint or with a slightly different sample size or whatever that might be, and then having to repeat testing. You want to make sure that you're saving time and money by thinking about those things in advance. And here's our contact information. So like I said, I'm happy to talk with anyone and be a resource. There's my email address. Adam's email is up here. He's right here as well. If you have any questions on kind of technical aspects of the QMS, reach out to him that we provide. And if you have any general inquiries, you can contact Lauren. She's our customer service liaison as well. Just some great websites from FDA. CDRH Learn is really good if you like very dry lectures. I mean, honestly, it is very CDRH, but there's tons of good information in those lectures. They're really, really good. FDA guidance, again, lots of great information just to kind of know where FDA is coming from in a lot of these aspects, and then the recognized standards database as well. And so now we come to discussion. Yes?
So you talked a lot about predicate devices, and you mandated as an example of a non-regulated device. That falls in the category, in my mind, of a preventative device. Where does preventative claims live in this landscape?
Very good question. And preventing disease is actually part of a claim. It very much depends on what your product does. So one of the big carve-outs is kind of this general health and wellness area, right? So if you're trying to keep someone healthy in a general sense, a lot of times that's exempt from FDA oversight, and actually it's an area that they call enforcement discretion, where they say technically this is a device, but because it's low risk, and they have criteria for what means low risk in their general wellness guidance, but because it's low risk, because it's non-invasive, and because it meets the requirements of a general wellness device, which again they kind of go through, they say we're going to use enforcement discretion, meaning we're not going to regulate this product right now. We're choosing not to focus our resources on it because it's low risk. So absolutely, when you're talking about kind of preventative care or health and wellness, looking at that guidance is really, really important, especially when we get into kind of like data and metrics and tracking for health. A lot of those are exempt, even some that you wouldn't think. So you can actually make personalized treatment recommendations if it is a well-recognized area of medicine. So for example, if you're trying to encourage a healthy lifestyle for people with type 2 diabetes, right? And you're making personalized recommendations for them around their type 2 diabetes, but it's things that are generally well recognized. I forget the term FDA uses, but it's like well recognized and supported with scientific evidence. So basically, you know, maintaining a healthy weight, exercising, those types of things. You can do that under that banner of a wellness device, and that's exempt. You do have kind of other products that might not be exempt, and that's when you get into places where we think about, you know, if it's software, what type of software is this? Is this exempt according to Part 520, or is it not? And there's a couple different guidance documents that you can go through from that. One's MMA, Mobile Medical Applications Guidance. Another one is Clinical Decision Support Software. That is also a really interesting space, because there are companies out there that are very much on that line, where as a regulatory person, I look at that and I say, oh, you know, they're not registering with FDA. Clearly they're considering themselves clinical decision support software, where I might, if I were FDA, I might disagree with that, but that's all an important part of your decision-making process, right, is again, knowing that regulatory landscape. So absolutely, it's important to analyze your product and make sure that you have a good understanding for if you're having something that's for preventative care, where does that fall within the spectrum?
Regarding that clinical decision software, so I'm evaluating a company that has blood flow imaging that's non-contact, choose it or opt it. It provides information on volume and rate of blood flow.
Yeah.
Where would, they're saying it's a class 1 exempt, and
that sounds interesting to me. I'd want to take a look at that. So, okay, there's a couple areas where that fits in to me at least. So there's also this, it's MDDS versus non-MDDS, medical device decision software. So FDA has gotten into this in a couple different guidances also. So if you look at the interoperability guidance, oftentimes if you have something like that that's paired with a hardware, right? So it's pulling data from some hardware platform. If that software is solely for the display of data, including images, if it's non-diagnostic, so basically it's not, making a diagnosis, if it is not transforming or modifying that data in any way, then that can be considered non-MDDS, right? Exempt. It's that transforming and modifying the data piece that is interpreted relatively conservatively. And in that guidance, I will say, they give a ton of good examples. So that's something that I go back to frequently when we're doing evaluations like that to say, where does this fall? To say, okay, what are the exact functions of this software? And it might be that 90% of those functions are non-MDDS, but if you've got 10% that, aren't.
So that's just, for example, we use Denovo surgery. And their statement as well, it's for optional use.
Okay, so that's something that I've heard before, and
From marketing and sales strategy, I don't like that approach. But, from FDA clearance.
Yes, so, and I will say, when we're looking at very typical clinical decision support software, there is a framework that goes off of the IMDRS software as a medical device guidance. And it's this table that I go back to frequently. And they're looking at there's two columns. One is it targeting a healthcare provider, or is it targeting the public, right? And then you've got risk. You've got two areas within these two columns. One is risk. I would suggest a cardiac surgical planning tool is pretty high risk. And then the other question you have to answer is this information publicly verifiable? So like, can the user verify that the information that they're getting back from the software is correct? That question becomes difficult. So let's say it's a BMI calculator. Yep, I can calculate BMI. That's a clinical decision support software that's exempt, right? It's just a BMI calculator. These algorithms that kind of get into making clinical recommendations, oftentimes they're multifaceted, right? They're putting in a lot of information, and it's not easily verifiable. So that's a tough one. And then I will say also, when FDA is looking at risk, I run into the same thing with a lot of companies where they say, it's still the clinician's job to make this determination, right? This is just one extra data point for them. FDA views it a little differently. They basically say, okay, we're going to, from a risk standpoint, pretend that the user is always just going to look at this data point, right? That they're going to accept this at gospel. And what is that? It's not just one extra data point. They're saying that, they're interpreting that pretty narrowly. And that goes into kind of the level of concern as well. So like if people are saying, oh, this is just another data point, FDA is saying, no, it's a high risk area. We're not going to buy that. So really good question. And it's a question where I see the same things with a lot of softwares out there where I'm surprised that they haven't made a submission. So any other questions?
No questions, but I got a lot of work to do, I'll tell you.
It's overwhelming at first, right? It is. And I think, getting the right partners on your team can provide a lot of benefit, right? Because all of this detail, all of this depth of information in any given area, not just regulatory, there's a lot of detail that you want to be aware of, right? And so it's definitely kind of getting those partners in place and making sure that you have the right strategies in place are super important. Any other questions? And I have no idea how we did on time, honestly. We might be way over. Oh, we're right on time. We're good. Do we have any questions online? I don't know. There's a lot of regulatory early in the morning. Maybe people might have dozed. So, okay. Well, I guess we'll have break time now. Is that right?
So if you want to stretch your legs, startup grounds is open if you need some coffee before we jump into the 10:30 session. So yeah, we'll take a short break and then Alison will start back over round 2.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you, Alison.
Yeah, thank you.